Welcome to On the Way, a podcast about life. But not just any life, it's about life with Jesus. Why do people follow Jesus, and how do they get started? And what difference does following Jesus make in their lives? Before Christians had a name, they were known as people of the way, people who followed Jesus' teachings. People have been on the way for nearly 2,000 years now. During the podcast, we explore the ways that people become followers of Jesus and why, and what difference following Jesus makes in their lives. On the Way is produced by the Baptist Standard, a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard. I'm glad you're with us today. Well, we're here with Mac Mahaffey. He's a physician in Cleburne, Texas. I'm going to let him tell a little bit about that. And you'll notice in the background, you'll hear a phone ding. And so he's actually working. And even though we're here in the midst of this podcast, it is during the coronavirus outbreak or pandemic. So he's receiving calls, and when those come in, he may need to tend to those. So we'll break in and out if needed. But we're here for the On the Way podcast, and the focus of the podcast really is about how a person becomes a follower of Christ and what difference following Christ makes in a person's life. Mac and I have known each other for about 10 years now, and we've shared some interesting experiences together over the last 10 years. Yeah, but that's the kind of thing that that family does. Brothers in Christ do. We share experiences. Well, one of the things that you and I haven't talked about, Mac, because really from the beginning of our relationship, we sort of jumped into the middle of things. I know you're a follower of Christ. You've been really open about that. But one of the things that we haven't talked about is how that happened. How did you become a follower of Christ?
If I look back at it, I was, everybody says I was raised in a Christian home. I reply with, I hope it was a flawed one, because none of us have perfect environments growing up. And I think the purpose of that is so that Jesus can be even more paramount and more necessary in our lives. So I think that if you look at like my upbringing, you can say I grew up in the church, around the church, in a relatively tumultuous church time as our generation was in, where so many Baptists were leaving the Baptist church and doing their own thing, home churches, Bible churches. Those kind of things became a pretty common thread. My family was not any different in that they joined a non-denominational home church. They had a situation where they just weren't happy with the church they were in, and so they started a home church and became the non-denominational Bible church that we know now. And then, the Maranatha movement of the early 80s and everything else. But my exposure to faith was from a young age, of course, but pretty topical in my home. And then, in my teenage years, 11 to 12, I started playing the guitar. I was a musician, and I started playing trombone when I was 9, piano and singing, and even took ballet for a couple of years. So we were a busy family in the mid 80s, just like everybody else was. But we didn't really talk about faith that much. I mean, the closest, I think, conversation my dad and I got to faith was just pretty limited. I mean, it was prayer, topically prayer, and then he did make an effort to address things, socially, and then, turn the other cheek type conversations, some pretty biblical truths and a very moral home. But I think that I really met Jesus when I was kind of for my first experience. It was kind of one of those camping trips to Colorado. You're completely exhausted carrying 50-pound packs when you're 13. And then you end up at the top of a mountain that's obviously made by God. And so I was able to kind of really establish my faith then, and I accepted Jesus into my heart at that point. And then just kind of stayed superficial with my faith for the next couple of years, and always kind of bent towards music. I led worship for the entirety of my youth bands, churches, um, into college, and obviously I studied music in college as well, and medicine. I did a dual degree, which is like completely polar opposite, but really in the brain works pretty well together. But I really reestablished my faith. The Lord really met me when I was 21, when I rededicated my life to the Lord, and not at the product of heavy sin. I think all of us deal with heavy sin, but more of just knowing how lost I really was, and the purpose of my having led worship for a decade and been in an environment where I was very selfish and uh, very proud of myself. Um, and man, that's when I feel like my true like dedication to the Lord was in my early 20s, and that really spun things around.
I want to go back to you talked about that you were a musician and you led music in church, and then at 21 you rededicated your life.
Yeah, I think what I was dealing with was a lot of fear. I was applying for medical school, felt like a lot of unknowns, had a kind of a tumultuous type of relationship, friendship
Mm.
with a young lady that I just knew wasn't going to progress, and yet I let it linger, and I just um, was just dealing with the fear of being alone. My parents were going through some financial challenges as well, and so I was kind of looking at med school and the expense of it, and everything kind of falling on me. And it wasn't something that I hadn't been through, but it was really adventuring into the unknown. And I had a lot going for me, and I had a lot of success in both music and medicine. And I had music professors begging me to turn my back on medicine and
Mm.
um, be in music, be a performer, be a professional trombone player, because I had the ability to do that. And they really were discouraged that I got into medical school. And so it's just deciding about medical school versus doing a master's in music, which is like, oh, woe is me. Wow, what a terrible place to be. That just sounds
Yeah, to have to
rough.
choose between two masters. So how did you choose?
The Lord really chose for me.
All right.
So in that same, so that around that, just after that time, when I went through kind of a rededication, a couple months later, I got a phone call as I was sitting in the computer lab, because those used to be a thing. But I get this phone call, and I use my flip phone, right, because I had one of those too. And the service was pretty poor there, and it was the University of Texas in Houston. It was a lady saying, "Hey, I just wanted to call, and I wanted to confirm, we hadn't heard from you, but that your interview is tomorrow." And I said, "Interview for what?" She was like, "Well, my name is, Carol, and I'm the I'm the kind of the admissions director for UT Houston. You have an interview for medical school tomorrow, or were you not aware?" And I was like, "I don't want to sound like an idiot, but I'm completely unaware that you were expecting me to be there tomorrow." And she goes, "Well, let me look at this returned signed letter from the United States Postal Service, and oh, it says Chris Long received the letter." Um,
Whoops.
and he had signed for it and placed it somewhere in her home, and obviously I didn't get it, and I was like, "I had no idea." And she goes, "Well, can you still get here tomorrow?" And I was like, "Yeah, I can. I'll make the drive." Um, It's crazy as I was putting in my applications to a couple of master's program in music at the time, and that came up. I'd kind of just said, yeah, not really. Med school, if it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. And I kind of tested the Lord, and that only really applied to that one school. And I just said, well, if I'm going to go, that's where I'm going to go. So ended up, of course, that went down so abruptly and surprisingly. When I got there, I was completely unprepared, you know, um, and it was the best thing that could have ever happened.
Hmm.
If I had had time to prepare, I would have thought about what I was going to say. And other than just the fact that I had to throw my stuff in a car at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and drive all the way to Houston, stay with Aunt Dolores. And then I really had no time to prepare. And it was the best thing because I showed up to the interview just completely raw, just like we are today.
Yep.
And was just able to be myself, and ended up interviewing with, just had one of the most incredible interviews ever, that ended up in them deciding that I would be a good candidate. And so I think they regretted it ever since.
Well,
They regretted it ever since. No, but I was just wild. I was like, sorry, you have a jazz performance major in trombone, showing up to do medical school. And they were really, they were looking for more unique candidates for medical school than the traditional bio and biochem. And they were looking for people with different perspectives and giftings and stuff. They've really, since that time, they've expanded their interest in applicants.
So you came to med school with a jazz trombone background. So how does jazz trombone inform or influence how you carry out medicine?
The communication skills people gain from being being musicians and having to work together with different people, is really unique, and it's intense. So I think that like worship and music, really, just like a lot of other things, like the friends that I had that were engineers and architects and businessmen, and there were some second lifers, in their 40s that were in medical school. Military guys that went back to medical school after serving 8 to 10 years. There were some pretty unique people there. And I think that they all tended to have a profoundly broad understanding of human behavior. A lot of them were input. They could just look at you and just be like, tell me what's up. I mean, it's like, what do you mean what's up? Yeah, dude, I can just feel it. I can feel it in you. I can just feel it coming from your pores, man. What's the matter? And, it's interesting because the volume of experience and the conflicts and the stress and the stuff actually bred these incredibly good, incredibly effective physicians. And I got to grow up around a group of like 24 men we had a small group, Bible study group in our med school, with multiple different classes. And I've kept those relationships and friendships till this day. Just very blessed. So it was definitely he with a capital H that put me through medical school, that desired me to enter into that. And I think I have the luxury of knowing that there's no question that this was the path I was created for from a very young age.
You've said something like that to me before, about that medicine is your calling.
Yes.
Maybe not in those exact words.
I don't know. I mean, I definitely have said something in those exact words to you, but I mean, I was called at a very young age to do both music and medicine, to the point where my parents were so worried about the dividedness of it that they actually sent me to Ames testing in Dallas when I was 14.
Really?
Oh yeah. Yeah. They took me to an Ames testing, which was an old kind of, IQ, dexterity skills testing, musician. I mean, it was everything, ability to recognize pitch, the whole 9 yards, because they thought I was crazy for wanting to do music and medicine. And I decided that I wanted to do that when I was 12 or 11. And I started carrying the trauma pager for the local hospital before HIPAA existed, right? And when I was
Okay. Yeah.
15, and I had a hardship license, and so I would run up to the hospital when the trauma pager would go off if it didn't have tests the next day, and just hover in the ER and clean up the floors and work with the staff and listen to the doctors talking to each other, and put in, help with doing anything I can, just as a almost basically as like a candy striper type, uh, but just a helper. And I started doing that when I was a teenager, and just getting exposed to the field and the career, and developed friendships with doctors that were Christians and doctors that were non-Christians, that were exceptionally moral people, as well, that had a real love for people and their careers as well. So it was an interesting exposure at a young age. So when it comes to calling, I felt it young, young, young.
Yeah. It's been with you a long time. We're going to take a 60-second sponsor break, and we'll be right back. High Ground Advisors has a 90-year history of providing investment management and planned giving solutions to churches, faith-based organizations, and charitably minded individuals dedicated to transforming lives. High Ground is trusted by over 450 nonprofit clients, and we're one of them. High Ground has partnered with Baptist Standard for over 70 years by offering a comprehensive charitable giving and investment solutions model, which includes asset management, planned giving education and development, account support services, real estate and minerals management, and expert legal consultation. High Ground and the Baptist Standard share similar values, such as serving those who are called and dedicated to transforming lives and being a trusted caretaker of legacies. They also value good stewardship, helping those who desire to be good stewards of their financial resources to find creative giving solutions to fulfill that calling. They know what they do to protect, strengthen, and grow our mission is ultimately in service to the gospel. To learn more about how High Ground Advisors can partner with you or your organization, visit their website at highgroundadvisors.org. So, you had this rededication when you were 21, and what was different about that rededication from, you spoke to that just a little bit, but I want to go back and revisit that. You spoke to this rededication at 21. What was really substantively different about that from your relationship with Christ before? Because, and I'm going somewhere with that, because I think that
I understand
that
where
was at
you're
a
at.
time,
I think that I think my understanding when I was 13 was that it was an expectation, that I would accept Christ. I do believe that in our immaturity, as children can accept Christ as their Savior. I think they can. They can sin like crazy afterwards, just like the rest of us can, and still have the the sovereignty of God upon them, and also the that their faith in Christ can wane and wax, and the Lord will still there's more grace. There's more grace in this God than we'll ever know. And I think that but I do think that the maturity of my faith was redefined at 21, and so I look at that as that was my independent decision, and I rededicated my life kind of in my own thought process and in my own acknowledgement of the need or the necessity for Him in my life, because that was what I felt like I didn't really have as much as the performance. So I got a Bachelor of Performance in Music, and it wasn't just jazz, but because that sounds cool, but that was like my
Yeah.
emphasis. But like um, being a performer from by nature and being like an absolute, by the way, an Enneagram helper too, if you want to know what I'm about. And then also like being a wing 7, because that's what my wife says I get, and a 3. She just
Yeah, I was about to say,
vocalized.
there's some 3 there.
So being finding out those temperaments in myself, and then also really looking at my lust for um, partnership, because I truly desired a partner. And so I think that like going through 8 years of performing, it just wore me out. Um, and I've had some other like separations of my own from churches too,
Yeah.
and I've been hurt by churches, and just like a lot of Christians in the world today have been injured by the people that should have nurtured them the most. I've definitely been injured by Christians, probably deeper and um, uh, in more devastating ways than I've ever been injured by someone outside the faith.
So tell me, from what you've just said, this injury in the church and growing tired of performing, rededicating your life, and this is coming together at a point in your life where you're getting ready for med school, you've applied, you've interviewed, and you said a little bit ago that you had some fear related to that. And all of this comes together, it sounds like to me. I don't want to put words in your mouth or write your story for you. But this all comes together, and you go through med school, you become a physician, and here you are now. You've been in the field for how many years?
12,
Yeah,
be 13
yeah.
coming up.
And I know that in the time I've known you, you've poured yourself into that. And when you say that medicine
Yeah.
is your calling, I mean, you're all in. So how does all of this come together for you as a physician, and how do you bring yourself and your relationship with Christ to what you do now?
Well, I think that to clarify on the been hurt by churches, the greatest and the most impressive and the most beautiful part of a church is the people in it, because that's all a church is. Otherwise,
Right.
it's a building that could be purposed as a gym if they wanted to, or as a daycare, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful daycare.
Yeah, as far as the world is concerned, our buildings are just that. They're
They're
buildings.
just buildings.
And
Yeah, and the
frankly, we ought to
people are the
be thinking that way too, because the
yeah,
people
and
are the church.
yes, the people of the church. We build these incredible structures and invest so much into them. Yet they're temporary, and I think that the relationships are not temporary; they're eternal. Which is also why the worst part of the church are the people. The people that go to it that have selfish intent
Mm.
and hate the red carpet, or man, this is just too loud. This is
Well,
just way too loud. This
I
music
want
needs
to
to come
clarify
down.
that. I want to clarify that about the carpet. It's not that I don't like red. I don't like that red.
That red, yes,
Yeah,
it's too
yeah,
red.
right.
It leaves
Yeah.
it leaves fibers on my shoes.
Hmm.
I think all of us have been around churches enough to where um, uh, we've been injured, and usually the deepest pain comes from those with the sharpest knives. And I say that because they can penetrate down to the spiritual, which is the deepest part of a Christian soul, and that's why the injuries can be so penetrating. And I think that's why a lot of the, if you want to just say that, the millennials alone, their attendance is incredibly low compared to mine. And
Yeah.
our generation of Xers is the last generation of attenders of church, honestly. And then it just goes down from there. The Z's, the millennials, they're not attending, and I think it's because of some of these things,
Mm.
you know. And their baby boomer grandparents divorce rates over 65%. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
incredible. So the witnessing of this is like, wait, why? Why would I want to go down that path? I always say one of the best neighbors I ever had was an atheist, and he was an incredibly serving, kind guy that would, if I had a shovel in my hand, he'd be walking across the street with a shovel. If I was mowing my lawn in the dark, he'd be walking across the street with his mower and a flashlight. And he's a single guy, lost his wife and lost his faith
Mm.
because she died from cancer
Yeah.
in his 40s. And it's interesting, the conversations we had and the kindness I felt from him was impressive. And so I do think that, like, uh, we have to have a perspective on humanism like Jesus did, which is, my perspective on Jesus. If you really go back to my burn for music and my burn for medicine, my desire to try and put everything I have into every venture I have in construction, and even the Pinewood derbies that I do with my kids, I'm intense. Okay. I'm intense
I know
about
this
it.
about you. Mm-hmm.
Uh, the intensity, I think, comes from the humanism of Jesus, because I see him as the ultimate humanist. He
Hmm.
he loved people, and he wanted to be with them, and he wanted to relate to them, and he had desire for them to be a part of his life, not just uh, uh, not just preaching from the pulpit, um, and not superficial. He was intense, and he made intense and intently made conversation and intently made relationships with individuals. Um, and I think that that's where I find my greatest effort is to make intent, to make relationships with people, my clients. Um, they kind of get surprised at how much I remember about their lives
Hmm.
and about how much I know about where they're at. And no, that's, well, but you used to work here. You remember that? It's like, yeah, I mean, I remember that because I make the intent to do so. But I think that's where true pastoring lies, um, is connecting with individuals where they're at.
So I want to bore into something that you said just a minute ago about the a biblical basis and being a source that has that. How does that come into play for you as a doctor, someone that people come to?
It's just being available to people in their time of need. That's where the Lord really excelled, was that he established relationships with people before he gave them advice. The way that he um, really had value, where everybody was valuable to him, no matter of their gender or their position in society or their color or their creed or their belief system, or if they were a tax collector come down from that tree. I don't want to be the rich young ruler who would have been the 13th apostle.
Mm.
And I don't want to be the guy that gets left behind
Yeah.
because of his pride. And there would have been 13 apostles. I mean, he knows. I mean, obviously, the Lord knew the guy was going to say no. Uh, he knew it, but um, the example of that is profound.
Yeah. I want to get personal for just a minute. It's interesting to me that you do have this background in jazz, that you do have this love for music and for connecting with people. You're in medicine. And here we are at a time, for us anyway, that's really unprecedented.
Hmm.
And you've got to improvise.
Yeah,
How are you doing that?
we had planned on spring break along with the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
That was canceled for all of us, I think. And I'd kind of given some predictors to my wife. Hey, they're probably going to shut down things, and she definitely was kind of like, no, you're being a little bit reactive, and I'm like, okay.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. and they shut down a lot of the areas around where we were going because of some positive tests. And so I said, we're done. We can't go.
Yeah.
Just because, not that we would be at risk for exposure as much as just being at risk of being around the calamity of the hyper shoppers and the preppers and the fear people that are dealing with a lot of fear.
Yeah.
And so and I knew that I'd be busy making decisions for the office. And so I talked to my senior partner, Dr. Johnson. He said, no, you need to take off. In the event that this is an exposure related, we're going to have staff that will have to be sent home on, self quarantine. And then, I myself, or even providers like my nurse practitioners and the physicians, may actually be at some point on a self quarantine protocol and doing telemedicine. So we've adapted telemedicine to our practice overnight, as we have done a lot of phone medicine. And you can connect with someone on the phone and FaceTime like
like
you and
we're
I are doing
now.
right now.
Yeah.
But there's still that limited connection and the lack of really examining the patient, and it gives you a lot more security in like what you're managing. And so we're trying to adapt into those new technologies. Even in that kind of fear, really it comes back to humanism and like, what is the nation? What are we going to do? How are we going to show kindness to others? And are we going to always pick ourselves first? And I think that that's where the church as a whole, and not a denomination, as I'm very non-denominational. You've known that from me for a long time.
Yep.
And I do think that the unity is the only way to bring back generations to church, because the disunity is why we've had generations lost to the church. And I don't mean just like sort of not coming. I mean like, and I don't mean like Easters and Christmases. I mean nothing. Completely disinterested.
This is a time when if we remember who we are and whose we are, and we remember Christ, this could be a time for the church to really shine and to do some really incredible things.
That's what I hope it does. And that's where I hope that the humanism of the church and the people in it, I would say those requirements that people have put on faith really distract from the only requirement, in my opinion, which is a love of Christ and acknowledging that He is the Savior, that He is the way, the truth, and the life, and that He is abounding in grace, that He is the ultimate humanist.
Well, Mac, I'm really glad that you're on the way with Christ, and I'm glad we're friends.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just because a person follows Jesus doesn't mean that person is perfect. Following Jesus is a lifetime of growing more like Him. Likewise, while there are followers who are more mature than others, who have spent more time growing close to Jesus than other followers, there are no followers of Jesus who are better than others. If you aren't on the way with Jesus, we invite you to check out the Follow Jesus page on the Baptist Standard website at baptiststandard.com/Follow Jesus to learn more about becoming a follower of Him. If you are on the way with Jesus, we hope that this podcast has encouraged you to grow more like Him. The On the Way podcast is produced by the Baptist Standard, a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. To make a donation, visit baptiststandard.com/donate. To receive the Baptist Standard weekly newsletter, visit baptiststandard.com and click on the subscribe button. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard, and I'm glad you've been with us today.